This morning, I have the honor of moderating the PI panel. We have collected a series of questions submitted by our attendees through our online forums and social media. If you have any questions during the panel, please post on Facebook or Twitter with the hashtag UCDPHSA14, and popular questions will be integrated live into the panel. Now, we will begin the panel by having each distinguished panelist introduce themselves, their institutions, and briefly describe their research interests. We will first start with Dr. O'Riordan and move along down the row.
Hi, I'm Mary O'Riordan. I'm an associate professor at the University of Michigan Medical School, and my work involves looking at the interaction between microbes, pathogenic microbes, and their host cells. So I'm both a microbiologist and an immunologist.
So I'm also at the University of Michigan. My name is Juanita Merchant. I'm a professor in internal medicine. I'm also a gastroenterologist, and I have a joint appointment in molecular and integrative physiology. So I actually combine basically seeing patients as well as running a basic science lab. And the focus of my research is on chronic inflammation in the upper and the lower GI tract and how that leads to cancer.
My name is Ken Kaplan. I'm a professor here at UC Davis in the Department of Molecular and Cell Biology. I teach both undergrads as well as graduate students. And my laboratory is interested in how chromosomes are maintained normally in cells, how the cellular machinery that's involved in maintaining those get compromised in cancer cells, and how the wrong number of chromosomes may contribute to diseases such as cancer.
My name is Shawn Burgess, and I'm also a professor here at UC Davis in the Department of Molecular and Cellular Biology. I teach also undergraduate and graduate students, and my research interest is chromosome dynamics chromosome dynamics in meiosis. This is an important problem because chromosome missegregation for the formation of gametes is a leading cause of birth defects and mental retardation and miscarriages.
My name is David Siegel. I'm a professor in biochemistry and molecular medicine in the School of Medicine. I'm also the associate director of the UC Davis Genome Center. I teach genetics to medical students, to graduate students, where I'm also directing those, coordinating those educational efforts. In my research lab, we study methods to manipulate the genetic information inside living cells using targetable nucleases and targetable transcription factors. And we try to develop those as tools to study genetics as well as potential therapeutics for diseases. And particularly, we're interested in neurologic diseases. And I was just teaching about meiosis on Thursday, talking about all those things.
Thank you, panelists, for those kind introductions. Our first question will be for all the panelists, and we will again start with Dr. O'Riordan. What drew you to a career in research?
I guess I started working in a lab when I was a freshman in college, and it was just tremendous fun. And my second lab experience was working in a lab that worked on HIV and poliovirus, and there were just a lot of interesting questions, and I was given a lot of independence even at that young age, and so I really got the chance to delve into all of these problems and figure out how to design experiments, and it was hard to look at anything else after that.
So I got started as an undergraduate at Stanford after my sophomore year. And actually my lab TA in biology said, well, if you want to go to medical school, you have to start doing some research. And I thought, okay. And so he recommended me to actually the wife of his thesis advisor. And so she, at the time, was working as an adjunct professor in someone else's laboratory. And, she wanted to test me out and see if I knew what I was doing around the lab. Of course, I didn't, so I started washing dishes first. And by the end of the summer, I was able to do something called, I forgot the protein assay. It was called the blue solution. Huh?
Bradford.
No, it wasn't Bradford, the old one. Lowry's and,
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, and there was something else. Anyway, so I started doing those. I was able to get a decent standard curve, and so I graduated to then running some of her cholesterol assays and running TLCs. And so I actually set up my coursework for my junior year such that Tuesdays and Thursdays I could spend the entire day in the laboratory and then have classes Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and just loved it. and finished a quarter early, worked in the lab full-time, and then applied to MD, Ph.D. programs.
Yeah, I guess I started off as a pre-medical student, had no notion whatsoever that there was anything called research out there. So it came to me while I was in college, and I went to a seminar by an immunology professor who was visiting, and I was just blown away by the intricacies of how the immune system work. And once I was hooked on knowing that I could really delve into this, I started looking for research jobs, and ultimately did a research thesis as a senior, worked in labs for a couple of years, applied to PhD programs, and then here I am, sort of.
Sorry. I think I wanted to go to medical school ever since I was probably an elementary school student, and I was very focused on that. I started as a freshman at the University of Colorado in Boulder, and I had work study as part of my financial aid, and so I thought, oh, it would be fun to work in a lab. I didn't know, had never seen research labs before. And the first lab I approached, they were studying vision in cats, and they said that they blinded the cats at birth and then studied them, sewed their eyes shut, and then studied them later. And I was like, no. So then I found a lab that worked on C. elegans, the model organism worms. I said, okay, I could do this. And so I started out making media, pouring plates, and I was just really curious about what they were studying in the lab, and a graduate student kind of invited me to help participate in his research, and that was to develop methods to make transgenic worms. We were injecting DNA and hoping it would integrate into the genome. But I think really the turnaround came, I remember it very specifically. It was January in my freshman year, and I thought of an experiment that I could do to test something, and then the graduate student said, oh, that's a great idea. We can do that experiment. And I remember that feeling of, wow, I can learn something that no one in the whole world knows. That I can discover this, and no one will know the answer except for me. And I can't remember if we actually even did the experiment or not, or if it worked. But in any case, I was just hooked on that idea of discovery. And I think I never thought about medical school again after that point. I actually didn't know about MD, PhD programs, so maybe I would have been interested in those. But so then I went to graduate school at UCSF. And then following that, I was a postdoc at Harvard University, where I developed the initial infrastructure for the research project that I'm doing here at UC Davis.
I think in my high school yearbook, I was voted as the guy most likely to become a scientist when he grows up. I don't think I was the smartest guy in my science class, but somehow my teachers were able to get me into a program that put high school students into a laboratory in a nearby medical school. And I was doing some early research as a high school student. I had no idea what I was doing, but we were staining some chick embryo fibroblasts with some fluorescent stain to study some disease that I don't even know what it was. But, I remember when I went to that lab that I was thinking that, scientists are all really nerdy people in white coats. I think they did have white coats, but they really weren't that nerdy people, or I don't know, maybe by my standards. But it seemed like it was actually kind of fun to be there. And I really enjoyed that experience. So I sought out research opportunities when I went to Cornell as an undergraduate. And there I found I had some aptitude for genetics, or at least I did well in the genetics class. So I said, well, maybe I should be a geneticist. And I applied to a lot of genetics programs for graduate school. But actually, when I got there, I realized I didn't really like genetics as much as biochemistry, because I felt I really wanted to understand very basic kinds of interactions. Now I think all these fields are kind of more merged together, and it's great to be at a place like UC Davis where we can have geneticists and biochemistry and medicine all kind of coming together. So I think really after that, I just, followed the trail. I did a graduate work at University of Utah. I did a postdoc at the Scripps Research Institute in San Diego. And then I went into a professorship position. And I think it's just something now that I feel this research life is something that I have to do to keep going. It just gets under your skin.
Our next question will be open to anyone, and anyone may start. In your opinion, what is the role of a PI as it pertains to undergraduates and facilitating their research experience?
Can you repeat the question? I didn't hear you.
Undergrads, what's the role of the PI
well,
for undergrads?
I can speak to that. I have a number of undergrads in my lab. In fact, last year I had 7 undergraduates in my lab, which is probably as many as I could handle. Usually I like to take on undergrads in my lab who have at least had the, kind of the first genetics course that they've taken, where they have some genetics concepts and molecular biology under their belts. I usually team them up with a graduate student or even a more advanced undergraduate to work on a project. I want my undergraduates to have a project where they have some autonomy. They're not just doing mini preps for someone. They're actually they are the drivers of their research. And oftentimes I end up hiring the undergraduates when they graduate to be techs in my lab where they can continue those projects. And in many cases, those students have ended up being co-authors on papers that we've published. And they've gone on to many of them have gone on to very top graduate programs in the country, including UCSF, University of Washington, Caltech. So I think that experience they had in my lab, really also sparked their interests in becoming a scientist.
I think I can add on a little bit. So one of the courses that I teach is on a senior or higher level laboratory class for cell biology majors. And really, I view my role as sort of I try to be transformative for the students. In other words, opening their eyes to the fact that there are unsolved problems. And many of them are pre-medical students that are in my class or off to professional school like pharmacy school. But my goal is for them to open their eyes a little bit and to show them that there are so many things that we don't yet understand and to question the things that they're even taught, even by me in that class. And so that's the same goal I have for students coming into the lab, is to have students who are interested in having a transformative experience. Because I think that's what happened to me as an undergrad. Listening to the world of research suddenly transformed the way I thought about my position in the world. So I'm always looking for students who are open to that experience, and not all students are. But when I find them, very much like Dr. Burgess said, it's great to give them an independent project, let them drive the research, and open the world for them. So whether they go to medical school or some other graduate program, they have that sense that there are questions that are yet to be answered. And I think that's what's exciting for me. If I can do that for students, that's very rewarding.
Is there anyone else who'd like to follow up on that question?
Yeah, I guess I could make a comment. I think that undergraduates that approach my lab, I would like to be able to give opportunities for everyone, but I have to be selective. And so in thinking about who I would want to take on as an undergraduate student, techniques are things that we could always teach people. The thing we can't teach people is to be interested and to really want to engage in the subject. So, I think, all of us are saying that we try to find people that have that sense of wonder, that sense of really, interest in the subject. One of the ways that I see that is when somebody contacts me the first time, if they just say, "Dear Dr. Siegel, I'm looking for some research, wanted to know if your lab is open." If they say, "Dear Dr. Siegel, I've tried to read some of your papers. I know you work on something like a zinc finger nuclease. I'm interested in this," that's more specific. And I think the more specific, the more you know about the lab that you might be interested in or what your interests are, if you could articulate that in some way, that usually gives you a step up in trying to get into a research lab.
I guess, can I say one thing, which is that You know, there are a lot of smart undergrads at all of our institutions, and science is just inherently interesting. So one of the things that I always hope to offer in my lab is the chance for undergrads to figure out whether or not a career in science is really the right thing for them. And one of the ways to do that is to give them an independent project, and what happens a lot is you try, you fail, you try, you fail. And is the person, and I think all of the panelists will recognize this because we all say it to each other, does that undergrad really have the fire in their belly to keep going on a project that's hard, that's challenging, that requires you to read papers, to think, to keep going? And that's a person who I think really has the potential to move forward. Others may be really smart, may be really good at many other things, and it may be that they're going to direct their intelligence in other directions. And I think it's really helpful to have that lab experience to help you decide where you want to go and direct your interests and your passion.
I would just say, even though I've taken students during the year, usually through the Undergraduate Research Opportunities Program, or ORourke program at the University of Michigan, I actually prefer the students to start over the summer where they can devote pretty much 8 hours a day to the project and get started and plugged into the lab, participate in lab meetings, and then at the end of the summer, usually 8 or 10 weeks, where they can actually present their project orally to the group and get that feedback, or even present with the postdoc who they may be working with periodically on their project. And then if this is a good fit for them, then to have them come and participate, usually continuing the same project during the year. I think it's a little harder to start in the middle of the year where they can't attend lab meetings and they have other coursework that's usually siphoning them off to their time.
Thank you so much. Our next question is, was there an instance where you were impressed with an undergraduate you work with, and why? Anyone may start.
I'm going to say yes. I had an undergrad who worked with me for a few years, and then he worked in my lab as a technician. And so he actually brought this project he'd been working on to fruition, and I said, okay, we should start writing it up. And he came into my office a week later and handed me a manuscript that actually was really good. So I was kind of stunned by that, and he's in a really great graduate program now and published a couple of science papers. So I was like, that guy was really good. But I think part of it was because he really was just so excited about the science that he spent more time thinking about that project than I did. He kind of went off on his own and really just made that his own project. And that's, I think, why he's done really well.
I think I've been blessed to have a number of undergrads who have come through lab and been incredibly impressive. And I think one of the things that always catches my attention is watching them evolve. So sometimes they'll come in pretty naive about what a lab is like, and all of a sudden they'll catch the bug, as it were, and begin to devote themselves to science. And suddenly their interests in other things seem less important, and they're in the lab more and more. And so, yeah, I've too had students who have suddenly become published and then gone on to great graduate programs and become NSF fellows. So you can see it when they're in your lab. So it's really that, the fire, the willingness to come in and devote yourself, because it is a passion doing science, as it will all say probably multiple times, you fail more than you succeed. So it really requires a certain personality and a certain passion about what you're doing. But yeah, absolutely, been very impressive undergrads.
And I agree with everything that's been said. I'll just give you a personal story about an undergrad who I think was truly exceptional. He was interested in a cell biology project, which involved using some fluorescent proteins, and he wanted to image them under the microscope. And we had a very antiquated microscope imaging capture sort of setup that I actually set up when I started my lab in the early 2000s. And it was not sufficient for him to do his project with it. He really was limited by kind of the speed and capture and what you could do with this microscope. So he took it upon himself to upgrade our microscope system. He bought new computers. He figured out all the drivers he needed to use. He actually had to be able to figure out how to connect, a cable to a modern computer to a 20-year-old camera. He really took it upon himself to make this project happen. And I was so impressed by that he, took this initiative. And I think that that's an important thing, that someone will see a limitation that they need to overcome, and they'll take that initiative to make it work. And that was a student I was particularly impressed by.
So I would echo similar comments. The first undergraduate that I had here actually went on to work for a Nobel laureate in Caltech for his graduate work. The second one got a full fellowship to Cambridge University and was doing graduate work at Cambridge in England. And the third one, well, the third one only got into the graduate program at the Scripps Research Institute, so, you know, starting to go downhill. No, I'm just kidding. But, you know, if I had to think about, you know, the factors that they all shared in common, it's this kind of passion that they're talking about. And I think, you know, so often in undergraduate education in particular, you're kind of on the receiving end of education. You know, you're going to a lecture and you're getting lectured at, and you have to take some tests. But, you know, you're going to this place, you're getting something, and then you can go about your life. And at some point, you know, you have to transition into more of an active participant in this process. And I would say that the students that were most successful as undergraduates were those people that that could see that they had to take charge and move it in a certain direction and not just come in and receive what it was that I was going to give them. They had to see it as an opportunity, and then they try to do something with that opportunity. I don't know even if I had that perspective when I was doing undergraduate research, but the ones that have really done well in my lab have had that philosophy.
Our next question is, how do your expectations differ when accepting a freshman undergraduate into your lab compared to, say, a junior or senior into your lab?
Well, all right, I'll start out on that. I would expect that a freshman would probably have a little less background in the science compared to a more senior student. They might be less familiar with some things. On the other hand, someone that would come to the lab at an earlier stage in their career would be able to spend more time in my lab. So a senior that comes to my lab is going to spend, you know, maybe 12 months there or less. And certainly part of that time they'll be thinking about their exit strategy. Whereas someone that comes in their sophomore year or their junior year or maybe even their freshman year, you know, might be able to make a longer term commitment. So that's someone that I could work with over a longer period of time.
Yeah, I would add to the, you know, or speak against the notion that seniors are somehow better equipped to come into a lab. I find my experience tells me otherwise. I think freshmen sometimes just have a problem because they're just trying to orient themselves in life in college anyway. But by the time you're either a late freshman or a sophomore, I think you're as capable as even seniors are. And I find that if you come in and have that early experience in the lab, you're so much better at connecting what you've been doing in the lab to your coursework, whereas vice versa is actually hard. It's like you have to go back and restudy what you learned because you probably don't remember it. So I'm an advocate for starting early in the lab. I don't think, yeah, and as you say, with a senior, you only have a certain amount of time. So I'm always telling students to look early for lab positions.
I would say I would prefer to see them start about sophomore year so that they at least have an experience, you know, with chemistry lab or biology lab, so you have some basic skills. But then starting early enough that you can start on a project that you can continue for the next 2 years and really get something out of it, whether it's an abstract, a paper, being able to go to a meeting to actually present that project. And that's hard to do if you're at the end of your undergraduate year or career.
I tend to take on upper division students, mostly because I teach advanced molecular biology and advanced genetics. So most of the undergraduates I come in contact with are in their juniors and senior years. And I have to say that most of the students that join my lab, I recognize in my course as being, you know, really exceptional. I've had an opportunity to speak with them, know how they think in office hours, and there's oftentimes I will ask a student just point blank, do you want to work in my lab? So I have that advantage. I did teach a freshman seminar called You and Your Genome. And it was actually this student who did all this microscope building. He was a freshman, so I knew him from his very first day on this campus as a freshman. And he just stood out in this course like I had never seen a student like this before. And I could see that this is someone who I wanted in my lab, so I asked him if he wanted to join the lab. And so most of the students in my lab, I've already had some sort of a relationship with, so I know how they think. I know that they're curious and such. So if it's a freshman who has an amazing spark, and I get an opportunity to see that, then sure, I'll take it. But because I teach upper division courses, I get most of my students from those courses.
Thank you. Next question is, to what extent do you expect the undergraduate to know about your research before applying to your lab? Anyone may start.
I think it is helpful obviously for them to know about the research that's going on in your lab. Generally, they come for the interview, and then I will give them some review articles and key papers in the area that they'll probably be working on. And I would expect that by the time that they come their first day, that they will have at least looked at those papers, such that when I'm explaining the project and the things that I want them to work on, that they'll at least have some idea of what we're talking about. Otherwise, you're really starting behind the 8 ball quite a bit.
Right. I would distinguish between the interview and versus getting once you're in the lab too. But I agree. I think it was said before, if you've read about the person's PI's research before you come for the interview, it's definitely a leg up. There's nothing we like more than to talk about our research. So if you come prepared, you're already a step ahead. But then once you're in the lab, yeah, I think you have to work hard. You have to really learn to understand what's going on, and the more effort you put in, the easier things will be, and the more exciting things will be, right? Because if you're just doing things by rote, by cookbook, that gets kind of old after a while.
I guess I'd also add that I really want undergraduates in the lab to ask questions, a lot of questions. And so I want them to be familiar with my work to the extent that they can ask some meaningful questions. Not, really, I don't expect them to really know the great details, but to really understand enough about the system that they can engage in a conversation with me. So I think that's important, for their experience, whether it's at the interview level or during their project. I mean, that should always be a process of interaction as opposed to one-way information transfer from me to them.
One thing I do, if students email me, they say they're interested in my research and they would like to work in the lab. I have a little application that I give them. It's pretty straightforward. I ask some questions like, why are you interested in the research in my lab? Many times, maybe 50% of the times, the students never fill out the application. I think they were just hoping they'd throw it out and hope someone would bite. But then I get some students who will fill it out, and then I look carefully about how do they write, how do they express their curiosity. It's very informative. And then I have a very open-ended question at the end. I say, what is your favorite gene? And, some people will, just put out BRCA2, or something like that. But then other students will, talk about, what is special about this gene to them, and, when did they learn about it? What made them excited about this gene? And so I look at that too, is like, how do they look at a very open-ended question like that? And that tells a lot to me about how they think.
Thank you. Our next question is, how much of your current skill set and research ability came from your undergraduate experience?
So I did undergraduate research in a C. elegans lab, and I think the things that I took away from that experience was more than the skills of actually working with the C. elegans. I guess the thing that I learned, the kinds of things that you always learn in a lab, like a lot of things fail and you have to try again and again, and keep at it. I think I learned about a little bit better about what it would actually take to do research. I think I learned those kinds of things are so probably less about C. elegans in particular, but more about just what it would take to do research and to see what the lab was like and how people interacted in the lab. And I think those are still things that I think about when I have students in my lab now and try to think about what they're going through and what they're experiencing and, you know, what my influence is on that process.
Thank you. Our next question is, knowing what you guys know now about research, is there anything you would change if you could restart from the very beginning of your career path, say, starting from your first year of graduate school?
I think one thing, oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, so what would we change in terms of our undergraduate experience?
Just knowing what you guys know about now, like through all your research experiences as a PI, through grad school, if you could start from the very beginning of your undergrad or postgraduate.
So, actually, and I'm going to be giving a workshop about the MD PhD program, and I actually have a slide on what I would change, and one of the things that stands out was I wish I had taken more distribution courses and not so many. Well, I mean, you have to take the science courses, and especially because I was pre-med, but I'm sorry I didn't take more philosophy, more English courses, history, because what we do a lot as PIs is write, and you've got to write fast, and you've got to write very well. So I could have picked up those skills a little earlier if I had probably taken more distribution courses. And then those are courses that you really are not going to return to again, those subjects, because you're going to be so immersed in science or medicine or whatever, you don't have time. And as you travel, as I've traveled to different places, I said, oh, gee, you know, now I understand what art history would have been about if I had taken art history. So things like that, that's probably one of my biggest regrets.
I think everyone's experience, their research path is very unique, so I think it's sort of difficult to think about what would you have done different, because, you know, I feel like we got where we wanted to be, more or less. So I think that if there was something I could do over again in undergraduate, would have been to attend office hours. And that's simply, I was terrified of professors, and I didn't want to ask questions about the material in the course. And I don't remember ever attending an office hour. But now, being a professor, I said, oh, how much you can get out of attending an office hour. And even if you're the only one who shows up and you don't have a question, you know, sometimes I just sit and chat with a student for the whole hour, and we just talk about, you know, life and goals and ambition. So I would, you know, the professors want to talk to you. They want to be with you. They want to help you. So that's what I would have done different, was attend office hours.
I think that's also helpful only because then the professor gets a chance to know you, especially in these large lecture courses. That's an opportunity if you need to ask them to write you a recommendation. They at least have a name with the face.
And I say tomorrow I am giving, I think, 4 or 5 workshops on the faculty letter of recommendation, and I'll definitely cover that.
Thank you. Our next question is, how important is it that the undergraduates who apply to your lab have taken upper division courses that correlate to your research?
I think we sort of touched on that a little bit, but my view again is it doesn't matter. It's nice if you've taken an upper division cell biology maybe, but really you're going to relearn it all in the lab, and I really like watching students connect what they've done in the lab to the course when they're, so I don't think it's that important, but other people may have different opinions.
No, I would agree. I think it's not the skill you come in with, because that's the thing we can teach, right? It's the thing that you bring that we can't teach.
Right, I think, yeah, I would agree too. It's the passion that you bring. And pretty much what you're learning in the laboratories or courses is very cookbook. And we have to kind of break that habit when you come to the lab, because it's not going to be cookbook anymore. It's understanding what a hypothesis is and how you put together an experiment, what are the controls, et cetera. And there's no answer. you're going to come up with that answer, and it may be negative, it may be positive, and you have to take that information and how to move on to the next question. But that's not what you're learning in your regular laboratory courses.
Is there anyone else who would like to follow up? This will be our last question for the PI panel, and if I could have everyone also answer this last question. What tips would you give an undergraduate trying to figure out what lab they would like to apply to?
I guess I would talk to PIs and ask about what opportunities you would have to exert some independence in your project. Obviously, when you first start out in the lab, you usually work with somebody and you have to kind of learn the ropes, but I think you have to really show that you want to take some initiative and that you're willing to put in the work to drive your project. Sometimes you get handed that, and that's a really great experience, but I think you're more likely to get it if you indicate from the beginning that that's something that you really want.
I would say demonstrating your passion and tenacity and also showing up on time, being consistent. If you're not able to come, that you let us know, because at some point in time, we're going to be depending upon the results maybe that you're generating or whatever the preparation is. And then, yes, you may have exams and things like that, but I think one of the worst things is not to let us know that you're not going to be there that day.
Yeah, I think, let's see, tips for choosing a lab. I guess I was thinking about it more, how would you choose from the many labs? But I mean, one problem is that sometimes it's hard to get into a lab. So all of these things are very helpful advice for you. But I guess, talking to the PIs, whether it's in office hours or actually making an appointment to find out what's going on and connecting, right? I mean, most of us have web pages. We have information out there. If you Google our names, you'll find out things, and sometimes they'll speak to you, and I think that's really helpful because you want to be, at some level, us motivating you is a good thing, and so making a match like that, I think, can be helpful. Obviously, if our research speaks to you at some level, then that's a great way, because again, you're not going to bring passion to something you're interested in, not to something you're bored with. So I think basically follow your gut in terms of those ideas.
So I was the faculty advisor for the genetics major for several years, and so I would speak to a lot of students who are trying to find labs. A lot of students will focus on the professors that they've had because they know them and they say, oh, I like this professor, or I would like to work in their lab. And those professors probably get more applicants, perhaps, I'm not sure, than others that don't have undergraduate teaching. But I really try to say, look, this is a huge campus. We have a vet school, a med school, a ag school, a nursing school. There's so many opportunities to do research all over the campus, and I try to really make that point that you don't have to stay within your department or even your major professors. Look at the entire campus and see what opportunities are there.
Yeah, I would agree with all those things that are said. So I would just add that, again, thinking about my path personally, I keep getting back to this transition from being a kind of consumer of education to someone that has to go out and try to find things, find information, find someone to work with, find out what you want to do. I think in your freshman year of university, it would not be uncommon to not really know exactly what you want to do. If you come in and you want to work in a Drosophila lab today, that's great, but that's not a lot of people. I'm really a big fan of trying to explore things, trying things out. I'm an experimental scientist. I like to experiment with things. But, as you go on, I still feel like I'm very much a student sometimes, still learning a lot of things. But, as I go on, I had to learn to take charge more. I remember somehow I found a lab to do research in as an undergraduate. But then when applying to graduate school, a faculty member wanted to see the brochure of a school I was applying to, and she wanted to see who was working there. Now, I had looked at that. I'd picked out some names, thought I did a pretty good job. And this faculty member came back to me the next day, and she said, I looked through this entire book. I looked at all their publications. I went through, looked things up, and I was like, really? They have publications? I mean, you can tell something about that, like where they were publishing and what they were doing. And, it's just, as you go on, you learn more and more about, like, what to look for, what are the questions to ask. And so even if you don't know at the beginning, I just give you the advice that any teacher would give, just try to dive into it, try to explore things, try to collect as much information as you can, and then, try to take some action.
And I can add to that. In joining a lab, you need to consider that you are going to put in a tremendous effort into your project. And so you want to make sure that you find that, or you come closest to the lab that will be best for you. Some students ask me, is it good to work in, sometimes can I work in 2 labs at the same time? I said, no, you really have to be committed just to one lab. Some students say, well, I've had 2 years of experience in this lab, but I want to have a different experience in another lab. And there you have to, have a pretty good reason for switching labs. Like maybe the PI is not giving you an independent project, or there could be a number of reasons why to switch. But I think that it's better to go in, depth is better than breadth when you're doing research, because the more depth you drill into a project, the more questions you're going to ask yourself, and the more curious you're going to be, instead of having kind of a superficial introduction to a lot of different labs.
I would just also throw in just, don't be worried about being unsure. And I think what you get from a lot of what we're saying is that we all entered into this like not knowing about research or not knowing our path, and that's totally okay. There's nothing wrong with that doubt. Just don't let it get in your way. But I think it's normal, so don't worry about it. Don't let it stop you, but we all experienced it.
Thank you, panelists, for those thorough and informative responses. Can everyone please give another round of applause for our panelists?